Divinity 2, The Dragon Knight Saga. Yet another obscure Western RPG I dug out of a bargain bin on the Xbox 360. And I know what you're about to say, oh god, not another one. But before you flee in terror, you should probably know this one's actually pretty good for what it is. The story follows your young dragon slayer in training as they gain the ability to become a dragon slayer, which immediately takes away all the many years of training they've had, which makes you wonder why they didn't do this prior, but okay. And I just want to stop the story for a second to point out, when they give you the power of a dragon slayer and erase all your memories, all you gain out of it is the ability to read minds, which is very useful, and the ability to see ghosts, which outside of the very moment where you see a ghost when you're given your new abilities, is like never relevant in the game ever again. But, okay. Anyway, your dragon slayer is now off to slay a dragon, but it turns out your higher-ups have been misleading you. Instead of a dragon, it's a dragon knight. And you happen to come across her right as she's about to die, and she chooses to pass on her abilities to you, making you the next dragon knight. And now all of your friends are trying to kill you, which you make short work of them, and now you have to hunt some guy named Damien down because, I don't know, he kicked you in the face once. I'm not gonna lie, the story is not the greatest. It's not bad or anything, it's just not terribly gripping, and it does feel like it falls apart in a couple of places, and simply becomes a quest of go here and do this one thing so that you can do this one thing later. And you know what the funniest thing about the story is? It's all the side quest stories and side quest characters that absolutely steal the show, because the main story itself it's okay, but in the side quests, I ran into a character that had his soul tethered to a chicken, and because I was secretly on a quest to kick all the chickens ever, I immediately then took 10 minutes out of my day to find that particular chicken, kick it, only to kill him, and a grand time was had by all. Well, except that one guy. Or this one time when a bandit asked me whether I'd prefer to give him my money or my life, and I ended up having a one-way debate whether the value of money was worth it if you didn't have a life, or whether the value of life was worth it if you didn't have money. Oh, and then there was that one skeleton I had a massive existential debate with that, well, you're watching it. Yeah. The point is, while the main story itself is just sort of okay in places and lackluster in others, the bizarre side stories and characters you meet on the side quests and stuff totally make the story worth it. Now, the game itself is a large, open-world action RPG, and I don't think you could add many more qualifiers to say this game was made specifically for me. Well, except for adding the term hyper-stylized and death metal soundtrack, but while this game does lack the hyper-stylized death metal soundtrack it desperately needs to make it even more a game I would absolutely love, instead, it has lots of tiny, intricate little things. Like, for one thing, remember how I said your character could now read minds? Well, at the expense of your experience, you can read people's minds, and that will give you various hints on things to do. This could include small, hidden little treasure chests that have great gear you can find, to automatically giving you essentially a free level up. So you want to mind read everyone, even if it puts you in an experience deficit, because at the end of the day, it's totally worth it to do so. But that's not all the insane little details this world has. There's stuff like tiny little switches you might find in a dungeon that'll open up a completely new wing to the entire dungeon. It's little things, but this game decided to cram in as much awesome, tiny little hidden details for people who really wanted to explore, and I absolutely appreciate that, because that just shows that someone had a lot of passion for crafting this world, and someone really liked to give explorers as much game as they possibly could. And since I love exploring, that's definitely down my alley. Now, in addition to mind reading, you also have your abilities as a mighty warrior who has lost all their memories and has to start way back at square one. But essentially you have three classes of combat. You have melee, you have archery, and you have magic. Okay, that's nothing new, but this game does let you swap between them instantaneously, provided you have the weapons to do so. And it works with a rather free-flowing and organic pace. So you can start combat by throwing a bunch of arrows at your opponent, rolling into them, using your swords to take them out, and then casting magic to heal when necessary. It works well, but it comes to my first complaint about this game, and that is, this game favors archery to a ridiculous degree. Okay, here's the deal. You could pick a melee character, but melee sort of kind of only half works. Essentially, you would have to lock onto your opponent to melee them, and when you do melee attack, it has a inherent forward momentum to it. And the thing is, when you lock onto your opponent to do this, sometimes you occasionally decide to just jump on top of your enemy for no good reason. Or the camera spazzes out when you get really close to them sometimes. It's a bit strange, and that's not all the problems melee has. If you're fighting a character that has ranged attacks, which is most of the characters, once they get hit once, they will run away, and you will miss every consecutive swing of your attack, and they'll get a bunch of free attacks in, which feels largely unfair. Now I know what you're saying, okay, so don't pick a melee class. What about magic? Well, magic works, but mages of course require MP, and like health, MP takes a ridiculously long time to regenerate. Like, even when I equipped a bunch of self-crafted gear to speed up magic regeneration as much as possible, it was still regenerating at fractions of a percent per second. And as you level up your magic, it suddenly costs more and more. So it becomes effectively even harder to use magic the stronger a mage you become, which felt a little strange as well. Conversely, as an archer, you can use ranged attacks to attack your opponent at the same pace they try and attack you. So essentially, you can sidestep your opponent, shoot them, sidestep their next attack, shoot them, and because the AI isn't terribly bright in this game, it's actually really easy to get them into a pattern where they're just going to try and hit you with ranged attacks, only to have every single one of them sidestepped and eventually them dying in a very depressing manner. In addition, because enemies tend to group up, taking a melee class will tend to get you killed very, very quickly if you jump right in, and as a mage, you're probably going to get killed just waiting for your MP to recharge. So your best bet is to hang back as an archer, take one enemy out at a time, and ideally use your environment to your advantage and try and find a spot where your opponents can't hit you while you hit them. But while that does initially come across as combat being entirely terrible, and to a certain degree you're not wrong, it does mean that if you do choose to play as an archer, you're going to have a much more methodical approach to combat, trying to find all the best strategically viable places to attack from, and it becomes a much more cerebral game in the process. So yes, while combat isn't exceptional by any means, I think it unintentionally got very, very interesting, as well as very, very challenging. But that's not all to your abilities. You have summoning abilities. Although the only one I got was my own custom creature, which you create with the limbs of your slain enemies. Okay, don't get too excited, there's only like 3 limb types for each of the 4 limbs, but still, it's a cool idea. Although I did find it a bit strange that while there is an enemy that uses the exact same basic character model as your own custom created creature, you couldn't get any of those parts from them. But aside from combat, you still have your adventuring. You have commanding your own giant castle, which you have to handpick your staff, usually by killing the other potential candidates, which was kind of interesting. As well as, I'm sure I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, you can be a flippin' dragon. And while this might not necessarily be the most intuitive controls, because honestly it just felt like I was steering around a spaceship instead of, organically flying around as this giant fire-breathing monster. And sure, while you can't attack individual enemies on the ground, just giant, castle defenses, it was still a neat touch, and it made this game a lot more memorable for it. So at the end of the day, while there's a lot in terms of gameplay that this game doesn't really get right, the end result is a giant open world with a lot of stuff to do in it, a moderately competent combat system provided you understand its various nuances, as well as tons of dungeons, tons of secrets to find, and just an insane amount of content provided you're willing to find it. And ultimately, while it does have its issues, I think gameplay-wise this game is great. And there's a lot of it there if you're willing to play it, and you're willing to get through some rather unfortunate bits. Oh, and before we move on, how could I forget to mention the autosave system? There is an autosave system, but it is used in the most bizarre way imaginable. Instead of being tied to playing a game for a certain amount of time without saving, or area transitions, or based on missions or anything, instead autosaving is based on locations. And I know that doesn't sound all that bad, but each autosave only works once. And the thing is, it doesn't really take into account context. For example, once you gain the powers of becoming a dragon, you can go assault all these various towers and castles and whatever. And as soon as you enter a castle courtyard, it'll autosave. Well, at one point, I decided to drop into the middle of the courtyard from just flying around as a dragon, and fought my way out of it. Except at one point I realized I was hurt, so I was going to back off and heal for a little bit, and I was running out of the castle under massive amounts of fire, only to be stopped by an autosave, cause I guess it seemed to think I was entering the castle for the first time, which meant that if I died anywhere near that very moment, it would have autosaved my death, and my save would have probably been stuck. And this is a game that not only do you need to manual save, you need to manual save a lot, because there are a lot of moments where you'll just be swarmed and instantly killed. Yeah, this game, it isn't exactly the most fair or well put together. Now, the overall presentation to Divinity 2, the Dragon Knight Saga, is... it's a mixed bag, but I'd be inclined to say it's average to a little below average. The overall visual presentation is kind of all over the place. The overall world and aesthetic is great. The world is designed interestingly, dungeons are designed very clever, and the characters range from being very interesting looking to being generic characters you could see anywhere. But visually, my two biggest issues are, first and foremost, this game likes to utilize filters over the camera. Early on, you will see like this weird brownish sepia type filter when you're entering like the first open world bit, and it makes the game look really insanely boring. And yet, weirdly enough, you can enter that same area later, and that filter will be gone. Everything's bright green and colorful, and it's awesome. And for whatever weird reason, it just likes to add these weird filters over the camera when you enter certain areas. And it's never to the game's benefit. And likewise, the animations are stiff, jerky, and not really all that particularly good. Overall, I think the visual presentation isn't very good, but maybe the audio will pick up the slack, right? And it absolutely does. The soundtrack is... while not terribly memorable, it's very fitting, and it works in pretty much every context that it provides. Weirdly enough, the various soundtracks seem to be tied to weird locational perimeters to various areas, so if you enter one general area around a town, it'll swap to the main town theme, even if you haven't necessarily gotten there yet. It's a bit strange, but overall, I think it creates a nice transition. And the voice acting, well, some of it does seem like it's kind of, at best, B grade. I think it's done entirely for comedic effect. I think the voice acting is well done here, even if it sounds bad and cheesy. I think it's done entirely on purpose. So overall, while the visuals could definitely use some work, the audio is pretty solid. Now, if you want to get a copy of Divinity 2, the Dragon Knight Saga, it shouldn't cost you very much. I got my copy completely brand new 5 years ago for about $20, and a quick look on eBay says you should be able to get it for $10 to $15 pretty readily. And at that price, I'd say absolutely get it if you like open world RPGs. Now, I do have one warning though. There's kind of a second game as well, known as Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, but the game you want is Dragon Knight Saga. The difference is, this game is actually all of Ego Draconis and its expansion pack, and honestly, it needs that expansion, because where the first game ends off is kind of on a down note. But ultimately, despite its many problems, I think that Divinity 2 is an excellent Western-style RPG for the 360. And that's a bit of a strange thing to say, because outside of the AAA market, there really aren't that many that are all that good. Just thinking back, there's like Two Worlds, oh god, Arcana, Gothic 4, ugh. There's a bunch out there that are just not very good. And you know, honestly, while this game might not be the prettiest one out there, and while it might have bugs bigger than the Cazadors from Fallout New Vegas, it is still a very solid game if you like open world action RPGs. And while I've certainly never played every obscure Western RPG on the Xbox 360, I'd put this right behind Kingdoms of Amalur in quality. I mean, that said, it's nowhere near as good, but you know, as a runner-up to Kingdoms of Amalur, it's a pretty solid game for what it's trying to be.